Tommy Markham's great-grandfather, Benjamin Richard Markham, opened their family's first tomato cannery somewhere between 1875 and 1880 in Lowry, a small village in Bedford County located in southwest central Virginia. Mr. Markham believes that his family was one of the first to commercially produce canned tomatoes in the Blue Ridge region, although he can begrudgingly name a few other early families that share credit for kickstarting the area's obsession with the fruit. Both the Overstreet and the Good families have kept deep mountain roots in this area and also stake a claim to this title. The history of these early canning families can become nearly as twisted and tangled as the fruit vines they depended on. The Markhams in particular would go on to have 4 subsequent generations involved in the canning trade and operated 19 different canning factories over the course of their existence. Pioneers in a new frontier of tomato processing, their story is representative of the types of juicy narratives unearthed when digging into the history of the Blue Ridge canning trade. Cultivated since colonial times, the tomato played an increasingly important role in the late 19th and early 20th centuries as national trends in urbanization and westward expansion pushed the demand for prepackaged convenience foods to new heights. Grocery store shelves quickly filled with all manner of canned products, and tomatoes rose to prominence as part of the Big Three, along with peas and corn, as the most popular canned produce items. This turn-of-the-century period saw the tomato's transformation from a common garden produce item to an industrially modified pantry staple, thanks to the rapid expansion of the commercial canning industry. In particular, farmers like the Markhams in Bedford and Botetourt counties, 2 rural farming communities nestled into the Blue Ridge Mountains in southwest central Virginia, took advantage of their locale's natural resources and adapted existing agricultural infrastructure to specialize in industrial tomato processing. As tomatoes became increasingly mechanically manipulated, so too did the local landscapes and labor patterns of Bedford and Botetourt counties, developing a new system of agro-industrial commerce amidst the mountainsides of the Blue Ridge. The tomato therefore becomes a lens for exploring and better understanding the development of the regional identity, material culture, and built environment for this particular part of Virginia from the late 1880s to the mid-1900s. Tomatoes are a hardy and adaptable plant, producing a large yield of fruit with arguably minimal effort once planted. Additionally, they can survive extended periods of drought, rocky depleted soils, and unusual growing locations like the mountainsides and gullies seen across Bedford and Botetourt's landscape. Ecologically, the fruit therefore seemed ideal for mountain cultivation. When I interviewed him, Tommy Markham, that 4th-generation tomato canner, said he simply believes Bedford County soil and tomatoes were made for each other. The Blue Ridge canning industry's specific location therefore became an intrinsic part of not only the physical product, with the nutrient composition of the local soil determining the tomato's flavor, but also the identities and reputation of the local people who saw their natural environment as a key factor in their success. Mountain tomatoes became their product, something that could not be produced anywhere else. Their natural environment was quickly transformed by hundreds of acres of tomato cultivation, and canning facilities like the R.L. Howard Cannery seen here became a common sight amongst the rural landscape. Carly Woods, a Bedford resident whose grandparents, parents, and 11 siblings all worked in the canneries, can remember that even the smell of the air would change during canning season when the countless numbers of tomatoes were processed. While farming had long been the main economic basis for southwest central Virginia, tomato canning became one of the first enterprises to bring consistent and widespread industrial changes to the area. Advances in canning technology caused industrialized materials to flow into this locale, which created a ripple effect of local industrialization. These factories produced not just convenience foods for a national market, but also provided financial incentive for expanding manufacturing trades in the area, and provided a means of financial expansion for the community. In their journey from the ground to the grocery store shelf, tomatoes had turned industrial, and they were pulling the Blue Ridge region along with them. Starting in the 1880s, national demand for canned products skyrocketed, and the scale of Bedford and Botetourt's canning industry rapidly expanded to meet this new consumer market. In the Blue Ridge, canneries began to appear wherever there was railway access, and quickly evolved into the lifeblood of the local economy, generating income for farmers, factory owners, and a diverse workforce of rural laborers, like the people seen here in front of the Good Cannery in Bedford. By 1909, only 30 years after Tommy Markham's grandfather opened his first factory, over 230 Virginia canneries were listed in the National Canners Association directory. This is double the number found just 10 years earlier in the 1899 edition. Such a massive expansion illustrates not only the public's growing trust in canned goods, but also the willingness of Virginia families to embrace change in order to respond to new opportunities for economic gain. And the fact that the Blue Ridge region had a long history of agricultural production from both wheat and tobacco farming meant that the transition to a new crop specialization was that much simpler for local farmers to adjust to. The canneries established in Bedford and Botetourt were generally smaller, one-crop operations within a close geographical range to one another. According to the 1909 Canners Directory, Botetourt County alone contained 71 canning companies, significantly outdistancing any other county in Virginia and many across the United States. At only 513 square miles, that's a tomato cannery about every 7.5 miles.
Wow.
And a lot of tomatoes in that area. Most of these companies are listed under a single individual's name, such as James Cunnings or E.L. Blankenship, both from the Boone Mill neighborhood. This type of ownership is often revealed by examining surviving can labels, which often lists the packers by name in the corner. This type of organization speaks to the decentralized nature of Bedford and Botetourt's canning industry. More individuals participating at an ownership level and likely operating a factory directly on land that they owned. This characteristic is an especially unique aspect of the canning story in this particular area. Unlike other major urban canning centers like Baltimore or Cincinnati, which were dominated by a few large canning monopolies, the Blue Ridge trade remained institutionally dispersed, made up of rural, independent, and often family-owned businesses. By 1917, the directory published by the National Canners Association lists tomatoes as the first product of nearly every cannery in Western Virginia. Despite the dramatic pressure of the Great Depression, the 1930s were the peak of cannery establishment and production for both Bedford and Botetourt counties. Over 70 canneries are known in Bedford by this time, and Botetourt's factories numbered well over 130, or now about one every 4 miles. And the enduring rural nature of this industry means that many more canneries were likely established, but were not known or recorded in regional directories. While this level of growth might seem surprising given the growing economic constraints of the time, it speaks to the consistent demand for cheap canned foods and the ease and low cost of continuing canning operations during economic downturns. Many local canneries did not survive the national financial crisis, but the tomato canning factories that did became especially important during the Depression for supplying jobs to the Bedford and Botetourt area, especially for women who worked as peelers and packers and were often unable to find employment elsewhere in such rural locations. These canneries represent a new specialized industrial direction for the built environment of the Blue Ridge. As rail lines were particularly important for the transportation of goods to and from the region, locations near rail depots therefore became highly desirous for cannery owners to ease transport and decrease hauling and labor costs. Access to a stream or waterway was also an important consideration for locating a new cannery in order to supply water for the boiling and steaming aspects of the processing machinery. And once a location was selected, canners needed some sort of processing facility. The architectural style of many canning buildings was not an unusual construction type for the area. Similar materials and techniques were used to create houses, barns, and other functional outbuildings. Wooden board and batten and clapboard construction were routinely used for creating agricultural and other work buildings and would have been extremely familiar to local builders. Later canning factories increasingly used cinder block or metal siding over earlier solid wood construction techniques. Like the tomato vines that adapted to the mountain growing conditions, Bedford and Botetourt's tomato canners took what they knew and modified it to meet their new needs. Canning factories were typically one-story structures, occasionally with an open end or loading dock for receiving fresh tomatoes. Sometimes this open area was nothing more than a sheet metal roof extended beyond the main building to provide some sort of shade, similar to the one seen here at the Guthrie Cannery in Bedford. Most cannery floor plans include one elongated open room that housed the peeling, packing, capping, and boiling processes in different areas. Another common feature was a smaller enclosed room for storing finished cans. If you look closely at the cannery in this picture, you can actually see the stacks of finished cans waiting to be labeled and shipped across to stores across the country, just inside the open doorway. Occasionally, these storage facilities were a completely separate structure located nearby the actual cannery, and some canners would even move their finished pack into town for easier distribution. The layout of most canneries reflected the assembly line nature of the tomato canning process. Each task or aspect of the tomato's journey had a designated space within the overall factory, despite having a mainly open floor plan. Marvin Weber, a longtime Bedford tomato worker, sketched the layout of the cannery he worked in during his interview at the Blue Ridge Institute and Museum in 2014, which you can see on the left. It reinforces how these buildings housed highly organized systems. Some even had built-in conveyor belts or pulley systems to move partially processed tomatoes around the interior to speed processing, which is actually what he's indicating with the steel ring basket that's moving across the space. This setup mirrored those used in other industrial processes, like cotton or linen thread in a textile mill. The space and activity of a cannery transformed the tomato both visually and materially from an agricultural product to an industrial one. And the fact that many companies use the term factory to describe the physical structure of their cannery only furthered the relation to the rest of the country's growing industrial movement in the early 20th century. Local historian Beth Worley also stresses that canning factories could also just be converted from an extra building that might be located on a family's land. While many new purpose-built factories were created, a number of cannery operations simply reused existing outbuildings and adapted their physical form for processing purposes. Tobacco barns, cow barns, or even storage sheds could be refashioned into a functioning cannery space. A structure simply needed to be large enough to house the workers, the fruit, and the canning equipment. Because Blue Ridge canners mainly focused on tomatoes, the canning season was only a brief part of the year, from August to late October, and therefore not all the owners invested the capital into creating brand new buildings for this temporary purpose. Defunct tobacco barns in particular were often repurposed as canning facilities, allowing them to continue to function in a modified form. Virginia summers and the canning process are both exceptionally hot and uncomfortable. Sticky tomato juices, hot steam from the boiler, and sweaty brows meant that canneries needed to be built with ventilation for worker comfort. According to local canning expert Charlie Woods, tobacco barns were therefore an ideal structure to repurpose because drying harvested tobacco leaves required a similar circulation of air. Consequently, many canneries were purpose-built with slatted walls to encourage airflow in a manner reminiscent of the air gaps found in tobacco barn construction. New facilities erected in this manner would appear both familiar and functional to local residents. One of the best surviving examples of this building type is the tomato cannery on the Arrington Gross Farm in Bedford. Believed to have been constructed prior to 1918, slatted walls surround the portion of the building that would have housed scalding vats and the boiler, which were the hottest areas of the tomato processing facility. Worker comfort was therefore an important secondary consideration in constructing a cannery. Most factory owners depended on local neighbors and community members to work in their canneries, but rarely created worker contracts, meaning people were free to take their labor to another factory with better working conditions as they saw fit. And with hundreds of canneries competing for workers within a close proximity, factory owners had a major incentive to create comfortable working conditions for their employees. The natural environment, or at least the climate of the Blue Ridge area, continually shaped the material presence of the canning trade in both Bedford and Botetourt counties. Other local canneries adapted to the regional weather conditions by using alternate ventilation solutions to slatted walls. Here on the left, the Johnson Tomato Cannery in Bedford installed louvered cupola-like vents into the ceiling to help with airflow, while two sides of the Saunders Tomato Cannery featured wraparound screened window openings, which you can still see in the top right image today, even though the building is now actually used as a garage. Some canneries, especially those repurposing storage sheds, simply left their building open on one side to facilitate better air circulation, or they moved the boiling and scalding machines outside the main building to decrease the amount of heat felt by nearby workers. The Johnson Tomato Cannery also took this approach. In addition to the louvered ceiling vents, the scalding vat and boiler stood under an open shed at the building's north end, and the scalded tomatoes passed into the building on a conveyor for peeling, which you can actually see just on the right side of the Johnson Tomato Cannery image. It's kind of the overhang that's dark on that side. The drive of the Bedford and Botetourt people to capitalize on a developing industry and their area's natural environment is mirrored in their ability to manipulate existing buildings and architectural styles to house cannery operations. Adaptability consistently represented the Bedford and Botetourt canning industry and the people and communities who worked to sustain it. Key to their survival were the business-savvy minds who realized that the massive expansion in the tomato trade would also require significant advances in the local service industries to support the canning factories. Can manufacturing companies were just one of the enterprises to capitalize on the increased local need for canning materials, and 4 manufacturing plants were soon established within town lines. Specialized tomato tools also became important for aiding in the speed and efficiency of tomato processing. The first patent for a specialized tomato knife, seen here, was issued to Mr. Frank Leadford Smiley of Botetourt County, and the construction of a tomato knife factory soon followed, opening the door for more industrial manufacturing jobs in the Blue Ridge. Smiley's tomato knives would go on to be the industry standard in tomato canning for nearly 50 years, recommended by both professional and home canners alike, each tomato peeler holding a small piece of Botetourt material culture in their hand. Label printing also became a necessary service industry to support the region's growing tomato trade. Piedmont Label Company was established in Bedford in 1919, and their bright, colorful labels were the final element in creating a truly local product. The flavor and images of the Blue Ridge Mountains soon entered homes across the country. Unfortunately, Bedford and Botetourt's tomato trade was short-lived. Starting in the 1940s, only 60 years after Benjamin Richard Markham pioneered the local canning industry, the market for mountain tomatoes began to falter in the face of growing government regulations and competition from rapidly expanding urban canning strongholds. The rise of canning monopolies like Campbell's or Libby's pushed small, independently owned and seasonal canning operations like those in the Blue Ridge out of business. Devastating tomato blight swept through the area in the late 1940s and proved to be the final blow for Bedford and Botetourt residents, forcing them to leave their canning roots behind and turn to new industrial possibilities. The canning buildings and the industry that they housed form a critical part of Blue Ridge material heritage, but they are slowly being lost to time. A 2014 architectural survey of farm properties in Bedford County concluded that tomato canneries were, quote, a vanishing local building type associated with an important agricultural specialization, end quote. Because so few of these structures still exist today, many, like the one seen here, are not even recognized as canneries by the current local residents. In another example, the Markham and Luger Cannery, one of the last canneries to operate in Bedford in the late 1970s, sits just off the highway on the way up to the peaks of Otter. The building now actually houses an auto body shop, and likely survives because it is one of the few late buildings made out of cinder block construction. Hundreds of Bedford residents and out-of-town tourists drive by it every year on their way to the mountains, most none the wiser to the building's forgotten past as a tomato factory. And this is a fairly typical story for this area. Like the Markham and Luger Cannery, following the demise of the region's canning trade, many of these buildings were again repurposed for other farm needs or reverted back to storage spaces until their eventual collapse and decay. Today, the dilapidated outbuildings once more blend into the natural landscape. They do not suggest the original strength and dominance of the industry in this particular area. In fact, Charlie Woods said that I probably drove by 3 or 4 of these canneries on the way to his house for our interview without even realizing it. And he was right. Despite growing up in the area, I really had no idea of this history until I started this project. Since then, whenever I drive through the Blue Ridge, I keep an eye out for these old, worn-out buildings and wonder what stories their past lives could tell, and if they still smell like tomatoes inside. There are unfortunately no commercial tomato canneries operating in Bedford and Botetourt today. The can manufactories and Smiley's tomato knives ceased production years ago. Only Piedmont Label Company, now operating under the Smythe Corporation name, survives as the last functioning holdout of this once dominant industry. But the tomato opened the door for other manufacturing and production trades to settle in the Blue Ridge and helped create the vibrant, flourishing communities that still exist today. The sheer scale of the local industry that developed from the late 1880s to the mid-1900s shows the region's complete embrace of tomato as a means of economic support. Canneries provided jobs, money, and a new material world and built environment for the local community. The tomato mattered to these people. And while the juicy red fruit might not have changed the course of empire for America, for this particular place, it ensured financial security and a competitive future for these scrappy mountain towns. The tomatoes takeover went far beyond the field, rooting this tenacious plant in Blue Ridge history forever. Thank you.